Good evening. Thank you for coming. Thanks for being here tonight on a snowy evening with the rain coming. So I really do appreciate you coming. I have been reading this book that Pastor Mike gave us, Boundaries in Marriage by Dr. Henry Cloud. It's been a really good book, an interesting book. So I would, if you're looking for something to read, it's been really good. So tonight I am teaching on forgiveness. So I'm Brett Hatfield. I'm one of the missions pastors here at First Baptist. I came on pastoral staff a couple of months ago, and Pastor Mike asked me to do one of the sessions. And so I was given forgiveness, and I'm really excited about that. I feel like I've received a lot of forgiveness in my life, both as a child, but also as an adult. As a kid, my mom liked to describe me as rowdy. I was all over the place all the time. I got in some trouble. I got in over my head a couple of times, and my parents had to help bail me out of that. But I always had to ask for forgiveness. So a quick story about me. When I was 8 or 9, we had moved into a new house in town, and one of my friends and I were out playing one day, and we saw that this builder had poured a concrete driveway, and we thought it would just be a fantastic idea to throw rocks all in this wet concrete. And so we did that all over this concrete. And the next day, this builder came down our street, and we were outside planting a tree for Mother's Day. I was outside with my parents, and this builder walks up to us and asks my parents if we knew who had thrown rocks into this wet concrete. I mean, like big rocks all over it. And my dad looked at me and he said, "Gregory, do you know who threw the rocks in that wet concrete?" "No, sir, I do not." He said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Well, he said he didn't do it, and he doesn't know who did it." So the builder left. And when he left, my dad looked at me and he said, "Do you know who did that?" And I broke down crying, and he made me go down there and tell the guy what I had done and ask for forgiveness. And I did, and he forgave me, and there were no long-term consequences for that. I did receive a spanking that day for my actions, but so I was forgiven, and it was free. It didn't cost me anything, but it wasn't cheap. It did cost me something. It cost me trust with my parents. It cost me not being able to play with my friends for a little while, but I was forgiven. And so as an adult, my wife and I have experienced a lot of things together, gone through a lot of things with one another, and she's had to forgive me for things that I didn't know that she would forgive me for. Hard things that are shameful. And I've received forgiveness for those things. So I know that you all probably have stories that you could tell like that, where you've received forgiveness or you've given forgiveness, and we know what that feels like. So I'm excited to be able to teach about something that we can all identify with really well. So I want to start by reading a passage in Ephesians. And we're going to work through this passage, and then we'll jump about halfway through this. We'll jump into a parable that Jesus told, and then we'll wrap up with Ephesians again. So our passage is Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32. And the Apostle Paul says this. He says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you." So Paul, knowing and understanding that people will sin, and generally these sins, even if they're small, will grow into more sin. And then he tells us to put these 6 things away. He gives us 3. The first 3 are these inner sins. Bitterness. Bitterness is a grudge-filled attitude, and it makes us poisonous and sour. The second one is wrath. Wrath is a swift moment of rage. I have been the recipient of wrath several times in my life, and it was probably deserving. Anger. Anger differs from wrath, as anger is a lasting, a deep feeling, one that goes beyond a quick moment. And so, a situation that requires forgiveness is the time when Satan can often work his worst and is the most dangerous. And he will fan the flames of hurt into an inferno of hostility. So we have these three inner sins, and then we're going to have these three outer sins. So the outer sins are clamor, which is this as an outward loss of control. Slander, a more ongoing defamation of a bitter heart. And malice, and it's this idea of an all-encompassing evil that's tied to these other five. So Paul tells us to put these 6 things away. These things destroy relationships, and they weaken the testimony of the church to the unbelieving world, ultimately, which probably hurts the most. What does the unbelieving world think when those church people treat each other with that list of things that Paul's given? What does the world think when they see husbands and wives treating each other with bitterness and slander? When you go to work, when I go to work, when I go to the gym, and I talk about my wife and the things that she's done wrong to me. How is that in any way, shape, or form a good witness to Christ? It's not. What about a father and a son who can't speak to each other because of a swift moment of wrath that's led to years of deep anger? How does that promote the church? How does that help the cause of Christ? It doesn't. What about people who used to be friends? That one small moment turned into something where we can no longer be friends, often trivial things. I don't like your lunch, to we can't be friends anymore. Ridiculous things. So in the place of those things, Paul tells us to put away, we're to rather be kind to one another, to be tenderhearted, and forgiving each other, just as God in Christ has also forgiven us. The model that we have for forgiveness is the way that God has forgiven us. C.S. Lewis said this, and I think we can all agree that there's some real wisdom in his statement that when I read it for the first time, I thought, man, Lewis, you know what you're talking about here. He said this. He said, we all agree that forgiveness is a beautiful idea until we have to practice it. You should forgive your wife. You should forgive your friend. You should be nice. You should forgive. Me? No. It's different. You wouldn't understand. It's a beautiful idea until we have to practice it. So I believe that when Peter asked Jesus about forgiveness, that he wasn't joking, that Jesus was not joking when he told him that he was to forgive 77 times. Matthew 18:21 and 22 says this. He says, then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. So Jesus is going to go on and he's going to tell this parable about a king. And this king he's calling all the debts of his servants. And one servant that's brought into him owes him 10,000 talents. And we are not familiar with what a talent is today in our culture, but just know it's about 6,000 days worth of wages. 1 talent is 6,000 days wages, and he owes 10,000 talents. We'll get to the math of that in a minute. So this is an insane amount of debt, an unimaginable amount of debt that could never be repaid. Impossible. So unable to pay the debt, he and his family and all his possessions are going to be sold so that the king can get some kind of return for his investment into this guy. So the man owing this unimaginable amount begs the king for mercy, and the king has pity on him and forgives him, and forgives this man and his insane debt, his unimaginable debt. Then the parable continues. So the man who owes this incredible amount of debt to the king, he's back, but this time he is owed the debt. Someone owes him. So a fellow servant owes him 100 denarii, 100 days' wages. This would be a pretty trivial amount of money compared to what he owed the king. So it would be like me owing $1,000 and Pastor Mike owing me the lint out of his pocket. Like, they're not even comparable, these two amounts of debt. So 100 days' wages, and he owed the king 10,000 talents. 6,000 talents, or 6,000 days' wage and a talent. He owed the king, hear this, he owed the king 165,000 years worth of days' wages. Let that resonate with you for just a second, how much he owed the king. 165,000 years of days' wages, working 7 days a week. Working 5 days a week, it jumps you to about 200,000 years worth of days' wages. That's what he owed the king. This guy owes him 100 days' wages. Incomparable. $1,000 to pocket lint. So back to the story. When this man who owes the great debt and is owed this small debt, he calls his fellow servant and he chokes him and he says, "Pay what you owe me." The man falls down and pleads for mercy, pleads for patience, that he will repay the debt. Unrelenting, this man refuses, takes him to prison until he can repay it. So word gets back to the king. He calls this man who owes this great debt back. And he says to him, "You wicked man, I forgave you all that debt, and you didn't have any mercy on your fellow servant like I had for you. I forgave you, and you gave no forgiveness." And the man was taken to jail until he could repay the debt. This is how Jesus explains forgiveness to Peter. Peter says, "Shall I forgive 7 times?" The religious leaders of the day would have said you should forgive someone 3 times. So Peter, I'm going to more than double what I should forgive. 7. No, 77. But here's this story. 165,000 years of days' wages. That's what you should be willing to forgive. So the characters in the story, who is who? I think it's pretty clear that the king that's calling these debts is God. We have sinned in unimaginable ways against God, and yet he has given us forgiveness. It's free. All you have to do is take it. I think a lot of times we are the man who owes the great debt but unwilling to forgive. But this is the standard. This is what Jesus gives. I think when we think about our marriages, when we think about our relationships with our kids, when we think about our relationships with our friends, no, it's too much. My husband, my wife, my father, my mother, my brother, my sister, my coworker, my boss, you don't understand how wrong they've wronged me. You don't understand all the things that they've done. 165,000 years of debt was forgiven. An unimaginable amount of debt. I think Jesus understood what he was saying. But let's go back to the Ephesians passage. Paul says, instead of those 6 things, instead of bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander and malice, instead of those, be kind to one another. Be tenderhearted and forgive one another like God forgave. And he starts with being kind. My wife and I, we have one rule. It's that I have to be kind to her. It's the only rule that we have in our, it's all that she asks of me, that I be kind to her. No sarcasm, no being mean, nothing like that. And I can tell you that when I follow that, when I do that one thing, when I'm kind to my wife, my life is so much better. Our friends can see it. Our families can see it. When I'm not kind, something is off. And Paul starts with that. Be kind to one another. If I would have followed this one idea, this one principle growing up, I think I would have a much better relationship with my family even than I have today. And I have a really good relationship with my family. I think had I been kind to my sister, our teenage years would have looked much different than they did. If I would have been kind to her when we were 10, and kind to her when we were 15, and kind to her when we were 18 and 20 and 25, our relationship today would be better than it is today. Mothers, daughters, kindness. Husbands and wives, kindness. If you approach your spouse with kindness every single day, think about how much different your interactions might be. My wife gets home, she had a hard day from work. If I'm kind, if I'm just kind to her, if that's all I am, much better. This same kindness was used in Psalm 100, verse 5. For the Lord is good. That goodness, that kindness. For his steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. His steadfast love. Out of his kindness comes his steadfast love. Pastor Greg talked about it this morning, this Hesed love. His loving kindness. It's the same love that we see in Genesis 3. It's the outpouring of Genesis 3. Adam, Eve, I said you couldn't eat out of one tree. And all of the garden, don't eat of this one tree. You ate of that one tree. It's going to cost something. But I'm going to forgive you. Even though, Adam, you didn't ask for forgiveness. Even though you shucked the blame to Eve, who shucked the blame to the serpent. I'm going to forgive you. But there was a cost to be paid. They covered themselves with fig leaves because they were ashamed of their nakedness. God came looking for them and found them, and they pushed the blame down the line. And so God curses each one of them in different ways. And then he goes and he gets animal skins. Well, how did he get those animal skins? Anytime something is done against God, anytime there's a sin, blood must be shed. The first bloodshed, the first sacrifice done by God out of his grace and his mercy for people. This is the standard of forgiveness. This is what God is calling us to. Undeserved mercy and grace. This is how we should approach our marriages. I know it's hard. I know marriage is hard. I know being a brother is hard. I know having coworkers can be hard. These are the things that God calls us to. 165,000 years of days' wages. Forgiveness. All flowing out of God's loving kindness. So that was the first thing. The second thing was to be tenderhearted. This word, this is also really interesting that Pastor Greg used this idea this morning of compassion. Tenderhearted, compassion, they're so close, they're almost inseparable. one who has a greater love, giving it to the lesser. The mother with the child in the womb. Forgiveness, tenderheartedness. When I start thinking about being tenderhearted, I think about how children, when they're faced with something that's hard and it hurts them, down in their soul, down in their bones, it hurts them. You can see tenderheartedness. It's easily noticed. But I also think about the opposite of tenderheartedness, the hard-heartedness. Pharaoh is hard-hearted. Pharaoh doesn't relent. Pharaoh doesn't give an inch. Pharaoh won't give anything to God. Hard-hearted. Don't be that. Be tenderhearted. Be meek. Looking for opportunity to forgive. Willing to forgive. Handing it out because it's free, because God has given it to us. Knowing that we have all this debt that we could never pay, that we can never be good enough, and God has handed it to us. Take it. It's how we're to approach our relationships with our spouse and with our siblings and with our parents and with our coworkers and with our bosses and with our friends and with anybody else you come into any kind of contact with. Being willing to forgive does not mean you're weak. There's strength in that. And then finally, we should forgive one another. And Paul's last thing, kind, tender, forgive. And we cannot leave this idea of the standard of forgiveness, the standard that God set for us. I know I've said this like 7 times. 165,000 days' wages. That's what the king forgave this man. That's the way that Jesus put it to Peter that he was supposed to forgive. I don't know that I can go back home and have some kind of interaction with my wife or with my neighbor and not think about that. That's how I'm supposed to forgive. And insight into Bread's heart, I am not generally quick to forgive. It takes me time. And that's not right. That's not what God called me to. That's not the standard that Jesus set up. Quick. That's the standard. Free. That's the standard. Not waving it over you time and time again to remind you of all the ways that you've wronged me. Does God do that to you? No, he doesn't do it to me either. I think that we have to remember that none of us are perfect. I'm not perfect. My wife is not perfect. Your husband is not perfect. Your son, your daughter, not perfect. Your parents, your boss, your friends, your pastor, not perfect. Not even close. Miles from it. I read an illustration today, and I thought it was really interesting. There were these 2 ants, and they were arguing about which one was taller, standing at the foot of Mount Everest. I'm more perfect than you. No, I'm better than you. No. I'm better than you. No. I'm not perfect. I need to be willing to forgive, understanding that I'm standing in front of 165,000 years of days' wages that I've done wrong. And anytime we wrong someone, we need to be ready to ask for forgiveness. I know when I've done something wrong towards my wife. I'm not stupid. Generally, I do it out of anger because I want her to feel like I feel. Revenge. It's not what God called me to. God called me to forgiveness. God called me to a standard that he set up. Not 3 times, not 7 times. 165,000 days of wages time. That's how many times. So when we ask God for forgiveness, it's unconditional and it's immediate. But we always have to remember that the goal of forgiveness is reconciliation and restoration. Satan is adamantly opposed to those things. When there's a wedge between my wife and I, Satan is winning, and she tells me that sometimes. You're letting Satan win right now. She actually said that to me before because it was probably true. While it's unconditional and immediate, it's also free. But it isn't cheap. When we do something wrong, there's a price to be paid. There's a trust to be rebuilt. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Not lording it over someone, but understanding that I have something to be rebuilt. There are consequences. There's always consequences for our sin. There's always consequences when we do something wrong. But we need to be quick to forgive. We need to be willing to forgive. We need to be ready to forgive. We need to be ready and willing and able to bring people back, to restore them. That's a beautiful thing. Restoration is a beautiful thing. When someone is dead in their sin and made alive in Christ, that's a beautiful thing. When we forgive, it has to be final. We don't lose our forgiveness. God doesn't go back on that, and we shouldn't either. When you tell someone you forgive them, when I tell someone that I should forgive them, it has to be final. If I'm wavering, if I'm wishy-washy, I should hold on. I need to pray about that. When God forgave us, it was finished. And that's how we need to approach our relationships with people. So I want to end with these 3 questions. These are, I guess, application questions for you. So, is there someone in your life who you need to forgive? What's keeping you from forgiving that person? 2, is there someone in your life that you need to ask for forgiveness? That you've wronged them? What's stopping you from going to that person, confessing and asking for forgiveness? And 3, how is a lack of forgiveness concerning someone else's sins or failing to confess your own sin affecting your relationship with other people? And then how is it affecting your relationship with God? Thanks for coming today. Thanks for listening to me talk about forgiveness. I think if you can leave with one thing, I guarantee you know what it is already. The standard of forgiveness that Jesus set up for us is that we are to forgive 165,000 days worth of wages, 165,000 years worth of days' wages. There it is. That's the standard. Not 7 and not 3. This unimaginable amount. I'm going to pray and then we'll be done. Father, thank you for all the ways that you've forgiven us. All the ways that you have loved us in the midst of our sin. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. Past, present, and future sins. Father, I thank you for the amazing amount of forgiveness and love that you have for us, and the grace and the mercy that come from those things. Father, I pray that our relationships would be restored, that we can look at people and have the same kind of grace and mercy that you've had towards us. We love you and we praise you. In your name, amen.